I stepped off the ferry with my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, squinting at the morning sun filtering through a thick blanket of fog. Vancouver Island stretched out before me, all mist and shadows and towering trees. I'd worked plenty of logging sites before, but something about this place felt different right away. The company truck waited in the parking lot, Atticus Santos leaning against the hood. I recognized him from his profile picture in the job posting. Weathered face, gray-streaked beard, the kind of guy who'd spent more time in forests than towns. "Miles Moss?" he asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "That's me." I shifted my bag and extended my hand. His grip was firm, calloused from decades of the same work I'd been doing for just 8 years. "Good timing. We're heading out to the site now. Throw your gear in the back." I tossed my duffel into the truck bed and climbed into the passenger seat. Atticus drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, navigating winding roads that cut deeper into the island's interior. The trees grew taller, older, packed more tightly together the farther we went. "First time on the island?" he finally asked. "Yeah, worked mostly Oregon and Washington until now." He nodded. "Different here. Older forest. More particular." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I didn't ask. The logging industry attracted its share of odd characters, and I'd learned not to read too much into cryptic comments. The road narrowed as we climbed higher, the forest pressing in on both sides. The trees seemed to swallow the light, creating a premature dusk despite the morning hour. I'd worked in dense forests before, but this felt unusually close, like the woods were watching our intrusion. "We're setting up a new section today," Atticus said. "You'll be paired with Eugene Matthews. Good man. Knows what he's doing." "Sounds good." We pulled into a small clearing where several trucks were already parked. Equipment cases were stacked neatly, and a few men moved around checking chainsaws and safety gear. The site looked professional, well organized, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The men spoke in low voices, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Atticus killed the engine and turned to face me. "Before we get started, there's something you need to know." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a laminated card, about the size of a credit card. "These are the rules. Memorize them. Follow them. No exceptions." I took the card, expecting the usual safety protocols, proper chainsaw handling, communication procedures, emergency contacts. Instead, I found 6 numbered rules printed in bold black text. 1. Always work in pairs. 2. Never be alone in the forest. 3. Stay within 15 minutes of the trucks. 4. If crows fly toward you, walk in the direction they came from. 5. If you see a white crow, do not move until it leaves. 6. Ignore any sounds of crying children. I read the list twice, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I looked up at Atticus, who watched me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Is this some kind of joke? Hazing the new guy? His expression didn't change. "These rules keep people alive, Miles. I don't care if you understand them. I don't care if you believe in them. But you will follow them, or you won't work on my site." Something in his tone made me hold back the laugh that had been building. His eyes held no humor, only a dead seriousness that seemed excessive even for safety protocols. "Sure, okay." I pocketed the card, deciding to play along until I figured out what was really going on. Atticus seemed to accept my response, though I could tell he wasn't convinced of my sincerity. He got out of the truck and I followed, grabbing my gear from the back. "Eugene," he called. A man looked up from where he was checking a chainsaw. He was shorter than me, with a wiry build and watchful dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. A jagged scar ran along his forearm, visible below his rolled-up sleeve. "This is Miles, your new partner. Get him set up and show him the section we're clearing today." Eugene nodded but said nothing as he approached. His handshake was quick, almost reluctant, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "You got your gear?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. "Yeah, all set." "Good. We're taking the east section. Stay close." He turned and headed toward the tree line without waiting for my response. I glanced at Atticus, who gave me a nod that clearly meant follow him. I adjusted my hard hat and jogged to catch up. The moment we stepped past the first line of trees, the forest seemed to close around us. The sounds from the staging area faded almost immediately, replaced by an unusual stillness. Most forests had a constant background noise: birds, insects, wind through leaves. But here, the sounds seemed muted, distant. Eugene moved with practiced efficiency, never straying more than a few feet from me as we made our way to our assigned section. I noticed how his eyes constantly scanned our surroundings, checking the trees, the ground, the sky. It wasn't the normal awareness of an experienced logger looking for hazards. It was something more intense, almost like fear. We reached a stand of Douglas firs marked for cutting. Eugene set down his equipment and began his safety checks. I did the same, the familiar routine helping to settle the uneasiness I'd been feeling. "So," I said, trying to break the awkward silence, "what's with the rules? The white crows and crying kids?" Eugene paused, his hands going still on his chainsaw. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at the forest floor. When he finally looked up, his expression was carefully blank. "Just follow them." But why? I mean, some make sense, working in pairs, staying near the trucks, but the others? "Just follow them," he repeated, his voice flat. "That's all you need to know." He turned away and started his chainsaw, effectively ending the conversation. I stood there for a moment, frustrated by the non-answer, before starting my own saw. Whatever game they were playing, I'd figure it out eventually. We fell into a rhythm as the day progressed. Eugene was skilled and efficient, and despite his reticence, we worked well together. I noticed he never let me out of his sight. If I moved to a different tree, he adjusted his position to keep me in view. If I walked a few yards away to check something, he followed. It might have been annoying if it wasn't so strange. At lunch, we sat on fallen logs and ate in near silence. The other pairs of workers were scattered throughout the site, each team staying within their assigned section. Everyone seemed unusually alert, even during their break. "Been working here long?" I asked Eugene, trying again for conversation. 3 years on the island, 1 year at this site." "You like it?" He shrugged. "It's work." "And the rules? You follow all those seriously?" Something flickered across his face. Irritation, maybe, or concern. "We all do," he said. "If you're smart, you will too." "Even the one about crying children? Come on, that's just weird." Eugene packed up his lunch without responding. When he stood, his eyes met mine directly for the first time. "Especially that one," he said quietly, then walked back to our work area. The next 2 days followed the same pattern. We'd arrive at the site, check our equipment, and work our section. Eugene remained vigilant, watchful, barely speaking except to coordinate our tasks. The other workers were similarly subdued. There was none of the usual joking or trash talk I was used to on logging sites. Everyone seemed focused on the work and on getting out of the forest as quickly as possible each day. I kept the laminated card in my pocket, occasionally taking it out to read the strange rules again. Part of me still thought it was an elaborate prank, but no one ever broke character or let on that it was a joke. And there was something about the forest itself that kept me from dismissing it entirely. The trees were too dense, too dark, the silence too complete. Sometimes I'd look up from cutting and feel like the distance between trees had somehow changed, like the forest had shifted when I wasn't looking. Other times I'd catch Eugene staring into the depths of the woods, his body tense, listening for something I couldn't hear. By the 3rd day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The work itself was routine, cutting trees, trimming branches, hauling logs, but an underlying tension persisted that I couldn't identify. It was like walking through a room where you know someone is hiding, watching you, but you can't see them. "What is it about this place?" I finally asked Eugene as we packed up at the end of day 3. "Why does everyone act like they're afraid of the forest?" Eugene carefully placed his chainsaw in its case, taking his time before answering. "Some places aren't like others," he said, his voice so low I had to lean in to hear him. "Some places have rules, natural laws. Break them, and there are consequences." "What kind of consequences?" He closed his case with a snap and stood up. "Let's hope you never find out." He walked back toward the trucks, and I followed, aware of how the shadows seemed to lengthen behind us, reaching like fingers across our path. The forest felt oppressive, as if it was pressing down on us, watching us retreat from its domain. Back at the staging area, the mood lightened slightly as everyone loaded their equipment. There was a palpable relief in the air, as if we'd all passed some kind of test by making it through another day. I looked back at the wall of trees we'd emerged from. In the fading light, the forest seemed impossibly dark, the spaces between trunks like doorways into absolute blackness. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and something else, something older and less familiar. I couldn't explain what felt wrong about this place, but I couldn't deny it either. The strange rules, Eugene's constant vigilance, the unnatural quiet. It all added up to something I didn't understand. And as I climbed into the truck for the ride back to camp, I found myself already counting the hours until we'd have to return to those watching woods. I faced my first truly unsettling moment on Thursday. The day had started like the others, Eugene and I working in tandem, the steady rhythm of our chainsaws cutting through the morning air as we tackled a stand of marked Douglas firs. The forest had its usual sounds, birds calling overhead, the rustle of underbrush as small animals moved through, the distant work of other logging teams. I was halfway through cutting a massive Douglas fir when it happened. 1 second, the forest buzzed with life around me, and the next, nothing. Complete silence. My chainsaw still roared in my hands, but everything else just stopped. I let off the throttle, the engine idling down to a low rumble, then cut it completely. The silence hit me like a physical weight. It pressed against my ears, made the hair on my arms stand up. No birds, no insects, no distant chainsaws, not even wind through the branches. Just a dead, empty void where sound should have been. "Eugene?" I called out, my voice sounding wrong in the stillness. I turned to look for him and nearly jumped out of my skin. He stood right behind me, though I hadn't heard him approach. His face looked tight, eyes wide with an urgency I hadn't seen before. Eugene made a sharp cutting motion across his throat, then pointed back toward the direction of the trucks. He shook his head when I opened my mouth to speak again. I nodded, understanding the message clearly enough. We were leaving, now. We packed up faster than I thought possible. I fumbled with my gear, hands suddenly clumsy as the silence continued to press down on us. Not once did Eugene make a sound or encourage me to hurry with words. Just quick, urgent gestures. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every step seemed to take too much effort, like walking through water. The silence followed us, an invisible presence at our backs. I kept wanting to look over my shoulder, certain something was watching us retreat. About halfway to the staging area, I heard the first faint call of a bird. Eugene's shoulders loosened just slightly. A few minutes later, the distant buzz of chainsaws reached us. By the time we stepped into the clearing where the trucks were parked, the normal forest sounds had fully returned. I took a deep breath, the tension in my chest finally easing. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud after the unnatural quiet. Eugene busied himself storing his equipment in the truck. "Sometimes the forest gets quiet," he said simply. "That wasn't just quiet," I argued. "That was wrong." He looked at me, his dark eyes serious. "Yeah, it was." That was all the explanation I got. The next day brought a different kind of warning. Eugene and I had been working since early morning, the previous day's silence incident hanging between us unspoken, but not forgotten. I'd just finished marking a new section when I noticed them. A flock of crows, maybe 30 of them, flying directly toward us from deeper in the forest. They moved as a single dark mass, wings beating in what looked like perfect unison. Their cawing carried an urgent intensity that made my skin prickle. Rule 4 flashed in my mind. If crows fly toward you, walk in the direction they came from. I tapped Eugene's shoulder and pointed. He looked up, nodded once, and immediately started walking away from our work site, heading in the direction the crows had come from, back toward the trucks. I followed without question, matching his quick pace. The crows passed overhead, their harsh calls seeming to grow more frantic as they flew above us. I couldn't help but glance back, watching as they continued in a straight line over the forest. "Do they always do that?" I asked when we reached the trucks. Eugene shook his head. "Not always. But when they do, you listen." "Listen to what? They're just birds." He looked at me for a long moment. "They know things we don't." We didn't go back to that section for the rest of the day. By Monday, I'd had enough of cryptic warnings and unexplained rules. The silence incident and the crows had left me on edge, jumpy at every unexpected sound. I needed answers. I caught Atticus alone that morning as he checked equipment lists by his truck. The other workers were gathering their gear, giving me a few minutes of privacy. "I need to ask you something," I said, keeping my voice low. Atticus looked up from his clipboard, his weathered face unreadable. "About?" "This place. The rules. What happened on Thursday with the silence. The crows on Friday." I took a breath. "And I want to know about the previous crew." Something flickered in his eyes. Caution, maybe, or resignation. He set his clipboard down on the truck's hood. "What about the previous crew? Were there problems? Is that why all these rules exist?" Atticus studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "2 loggers went missing from this site 6 months ago. Levi Sutherland and Craig Gutierrez." The names hit me like a physical blow. Missing. Not quit, not transferred. Missing. "What happened to them?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "Levi disappeared first. Normal workday, everything routine. His partner Craig went to get something from their truck. When he came back 15 minutes later, Levi was gone." Atticus ran a hand over his face. "Craig reported it immediately. We all searched until dark. Next morning, Craig went out with a search team, split off to check an area he thought Levi might have gone to, and he never came back either. I tried to process this. Maybe they just left? Walked off the job?" Atticus shook his head. "Left all their gear, their wallets, their phones. Their trucks were still here. And Craig had been with the company 8 years. He wouldn't just walk away during a search for his partner." "What did the police say?" "They brought dogs, helicopters. Search teams covered 50 miles of surrounding terrain." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Found absolutely nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing. Nothing." I thought about the silence in the forest, how it had felt like something watching, waiting. I thought about the crows flying overhead, warning us away. "And that's why we have the rules," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Atticus nodded. "That's why we have the rules." "Do you think they're still out there somewhere?" I asked. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw real fear there. "No," he said simply. "I don't." I was cutting through a Douglas fir when Eugene tapped my shoulder. "Need my pry bar from the truck," he said. "Back in 5. I nodded, watching him walk away between the trees. The chainsaw roared back to life in my hands as I returned to the cut, sawdust flying as the blade bit deeper into the trunk. The tree was nearly ready to fall, just needed to finish the notch and make the back cut. The engine sputtered and died as I released the throttle. wiping sweat from my forehead with my sleeve. I glanced at my watch. 20 minutes had passed since Eugene left. That was weird. The trucks were only 15 minutes away, and Eugene was usually quick about these things. I looked toward the path he'd taken, seeing nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Eugene?" I called out, my voice sounding flat against the dense foliage. No answer, just the rustle of branches overhead and distant bird calls. I waited another 10 minutes, occasionally calling Eugene's name louder each time. 30 minutes now. This wasn't right. The first rule on that laminated card flashed in my mind. Always work in pairs. The second one too. Never be alone in the forest. Shit, I muttered, setting down my chainsaw. I didn't like leaving equipment, but rules were rules, especially after what Atticus had told me about the missing loggers. I marked my spot with a ribbon, then started walking in the direction Eugene had gone toward where the trucks should be. The path looked familiar at first, the same route we'd taken that morning. But after walking for about 10 minutes, I stopped, looking around with growing confusion. This wasn't right. There should be a distinctive fallen cedar we'd stepped over this morning, but it wasn't here. "Eugene!" I yelled louder this time. My voice seemed to travel a shorter distance than it should, like the air was thicker somehow. I kept walking, picking up my pace. The staging area with the trucks was only 15 minutes from our work site. I should be seeing it any minute now. But after 20 minutes of walking, there was still no sign of the clearing or the trucks. Just more trees that all started to look the same. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest looked different somehow. Paths I thought I recognized twisted in unfamiliar ways, leading to stands of trees I didn't remember passing earlier. "This makes no sense," I said to myself, turning in a circle. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS. No signal. The screen showed only the time. I'd been walking for nearly 45 minutes now. "Come on," I muttered, putting the phone away and grabbing my radio instead. "Atticus? Eugene? Anyone copy?" The radio crackled with static. I adjusted the frequency, trying again. "This is Miles. I'm trying to get back to the staging area. Can anyone hear me?" More static, then silence. I clipped the radio back to my belt, trying to stay calm as I surveyed my surroundings. The trees seemed to press in closer than before, branches overlapping to block most of the sky. It was getting harder to tell which direction I'd come from. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The forest seemed to shift around me, like the distances between landmarks were stretching and contracting. I'd walk what felt like 50 yards toward a distinctive tree, only to find it seemed just as far away as when I started. I checked my watch again. I'd been walking for an hour now. An hour to cover what should have been a 15-minute walk. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I forced it down. Panicking wouldn't help. "Think, Miles," I told myself, taking a deep breath. "Think rationally." I needed to make sure I wasn't walking in circles. I pulled out my knife from my belt and approached the nearest tree, a tall Douglas fir with thick bark. I carved a deep X into the trunk, making sure it was visible. "Okay," I said, looking around. "I'll head that way, toward what looks like higher ground." I walked about 30 yards, then stopped and marked another tree with an X. The forest remained quiet except for occasional bird calls and the sound of my boots on the ground. I continued this pattern, walk, mark, trying to maintain a straight line. After marking my 5th tree, I paused to drink from my water bottle. The forest felt wrong, like it was watching me. I'd worked in forests all over the Pacific Northwest for years, but I'd never felt anything like this. Like the trees themselves were shifting when I wasn't looking. "Just find the trucks," I muttered to myself. "Find Eugene or Atticus or anyone." I kept walking, marking trees as I went. The X's were my only proof I wasn't going in circles, though part of me wasn't convinced even of that anymore. Because despite all my careful marking and straight-line walking, nothing was getting more familiar. If anything, I was getting more lost with every step. The sound was so faint at first that I thought it might be the wind through the branches, just a whisper at the edge of my hearing. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to listen. There it came again, a soft, broken whimper that made my skin prickle. I stood completely still, my knife still in my hand from marking the last tree. The whimpering grew clearer, transforming into words that made my stomach drop. "Help me. Please. Anybody." It was a child's voice, small and frightened, choked with tears. The sound seemed to float between the trees about 50 yards to my right, though distance felt impossible to judge in this place. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding muffled in the dense air. "Where are you?" The sobbing paused for a heartbeat, then came back stronger. "Please help me. I can't find my way out." The voice belonged to a young kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old. My mind raced with questions. What was a child doing alone in a remote logging site? Had someone from a nearby town wandered too far? Was there a campground I didn't know about? I took a step toward the sound, then another. Every instinct I had screamed to help, to find this lost kid before darkness fell. The forest would be no place for a child at night. "Keep talking," I shouted. "I'm coming to help you." The crying grew more desperate. "I'm scared. Please hurry." I took a third step before a cold weight settled in my chest. The laminated card, the rules, number 6. Ignore any sounds of crying children. I froze mid-stride, suddenly aware of my racing heart. The rule I'd laughed at when Atticus first showed me the card. The rule that had seemed most absurd of all. The child's voice called again, sounding even more pitiful. "Help me. I'm right over here." My hand went to my pocket, feeling the stiff edge of the laminated card. Eugene's words echoed in my head, especially that last one, about the crying. I stood paralyzed between instinct and warning. Everything in me wanted to rush toward that voice to find the lost child and bring them to safety. But the rules had proven themselves already. The forest silence, the crows, and now this. "Please," the child sobbed. "I just want to go home." I closed my eyes, fighting against every natural impulse. Then I turned my back on the crying and started walking in what I hoped was the direction of the trucks. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not sure if I was apologizing to the voice or to myself. The crying didn't stop. It followed me, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind, making me want to look back. Then it would shift, floating ahead of me between the trees, as if the child had somehow circled around. "Why are you leaving me?" The voice cracked with hurt. "Don't go." I kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, trying to block out the sound. My pace quickened until I was nearly jogging, branches slapping against my arms as I pushed through the undergrowth. The voice maintained the same desperate tone, never changing in its intensity or pitch, never growing hoarse despite the constant crying. That unnatural consistency made my skin crawl more than anything. "You're going the wrong way," the voice called, now from my left. "The way out is this way. Follow me." I ignored it, checking my watch again. Another 20 minutes had passed. I should have reached the trucks by now if I'd been walking in the right direction. The crying child's voice suddenly dropped to a whisper that somehow carried clearly to my ears. "They left you here too, didn't they? Just like they left me." I stopped breathing for a moment, then forced myself forward, refusing to engage. The voice grew louder, angrier. "You can't leave me here!" The scream held none of a child's limitations. It filled the forest, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I broke into a run, crashing through underbrush, no longer caring about direction, just needing distance from that awful sound. After what felt like miles, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling onto the forest floor. I lay there for a moment, breathing hard, listening. Silence. The crying had stopped. I pushed myself up, brushing dirt and leaves from my clothes. When I looked up, I saw a flash of orange through the trees ahead, safety cones, the staging area. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward the color. A minute later, I broke through the tree line into the clearing where our trucks were parked. Eugene sat on his tailgate, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. When he saw me, he jumped down, his face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Jesus Christ, Miles," he said, his voice rough. "Where the hell did you go?" I walked toward him on unsteady legs, too drained to speak right away. Eugene took a long drag from his cigarette, his hand shaking so badly that ash scattered across his boots. "I went to get the pry bar," he said, smoke curling from his lips. "Came back 5 minutes later and you were gone. Just gone." AI. I'll continue the chapter from where I left off. I checked my watch, blinking at the display in disbelief. 3 hours? That can't be right. I tapped the face of my watch, certain it had to be broken. Eugene jumped down from his perch on the tailgate, grinding his cigarette under his boot. His face looked worn, eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Where the hell were you?" he asked, voice tight. "I came back from the truck in like 10 minutes and you were just gone." I shook my head, still staring at my watch. "That's not possible. I was cutting that Douglas fir when you left. I kept working for a bit. Then my saw died. When you didn't come back after 20 minutes, I started looking for the trucks." Eugene ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing up in odd spikes. "I got the pry bar and came right back. You weren't at the tree. Your saw was there, but you weren't. I marked the tree with a ribbon before I left," I said, patting my pockets for the roll of marking tape. "I followed what I thought was our path back, but nothing looked right. I searched for you for an hour," Eugene said. "Called your name until my voice gave out. Then I had to come back here and radio Atticus. We were about to send out a search party." The other workers kept glancing our way as they packed up equipment, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something darker. No one asked questions, but I could feel them watching. "It felt like minutes to me," I said, my voice dropping lower. "How could 3 hours just disappear?" Eugene wouldn't meet my eyes. "This place, sometimes time works different in there." "That doesn't make any sense. I know that section. We've been working it all week." "Yeah," Eugene said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He climbed back into the truck bed and started securing his gear with quick, practiced movements. The conversation was over. I stood there for a moment, trying to reconcile what had happened. 3 hours lost. 3 hours wandering in circles in a forest I should have known. And the crying. That child's voice that wasn't a child at all. The ride back to camp was quiet. No one talked much beyond basic coordination about dinner plans and tomorrow's work assignments. I sat in the back of Atticus's truck with 2 other loggers who kept to themselves, occasionally shooting glances my way when they thought I wasn't looking. Back at camp, I showered off the day's sweat and grime, letting hot water pound against my shoulders. My muscles ached from hours of tense walking. I kept replaying the forest in my mind, the trees that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, the paths that led nowhere, the voice that followed me. None of it made sense. The mess hall was half empty when I got there. Most guys had already eaten and moved on to the rec room or their bunks. I filled a plate with lukewarm stew and found a corner table away from everyone else. I was almost finished when Atticus appeared, sliding onto the bench across from me with a cup of coffee. He looked older tonight, the lines in his face deeper. "Eugene told me you got turned around today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "That's putting it mildly." I pushed my empty plate aside. I was marking trees, walking in straight lines. Should have hit the clearing in 15 minutes tops. Instead, I walked for hours and got nowhere. Atticus nodded slowly, turning his coffee mug between his hands. "Happens sometimes. The forest, it can play tricks on you. It was more than tricks, I said. It was like the whole place was changing around me. Trees where they shouldn't be. Paths disappearing. His eyes snapped up to mine. Did you see anything unusual? Hear anything? The question hung between us. I hesitated, remembering the desperate crying, the unnatural way it moved through the forest. I heard a kid, I admitted finally. A child crying for help, saying it was lost. Atticus's face drained of color so quickly I thought he might pass out. His coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. You heard it too, he whispered. A cold weight settled in my stomach. 2? What do you mean, 2? He set his mug down with a deliberate care that seemed designed to buy time. When he spoke again, his voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear him. Levi Sutherland, the guy who went missing 6 months ago. His last radio transmission mentioned hearing a child crying in the woods. The mess hall suddenly felt too warm, too close. And Craig? The guy who went looking for him? Atticus's eyes met mine. Same thing. His final check-in, he said he heard a kid crying and was going to investigate. That was the last anyone heard from him. I sat back trying to process this, but I followed the rule. I ignored it even when it screamed at me. And that's why you're sitting here now. Atticus took a long drink of his coffee, then set the mug down with finality. You're not the first to hear it. Not by a long shot. How many? I asked, not sure I wanted the answer. Atticus glanced around the nearly empty mess hall, then leaned closer. At least 6 loggers in the past 10 years. All vanished. No bodies, no evidence. Just gone. He tapped his finger against the tabletop. And every single one of them reported hearing a child crying before they disappeared. My mind flashed to the laminated rule card. 6 rules. 6 missing men. The rules, I said. They're not just safety protocols, are they? They're warnings. Lessons learned from what happened to those men. Atticus's eyes looked hollow in the fluorescent light. Every rule on that card was written in blood. Someone had to disappear for us to learn it. What about the white crow? The silence? The crows flying toward you? All of it, he said. Every damn rule. I thought about how close I'd come to walking toward that crying voice, how it had nearly convinced me. What is it? What's out there? Atticus pushed himself up from the table, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't know. Nobody knows. All I know is that forest has been taking people long before any of us started cutting down its trees. He picked up his coffee mug. And it'll keep taking them long after we're gone. He turned to leave, then paused. You followed the rules today. That's why you made it back. Remember that tomorrow. And the day after. And every day you work in those woods. I watched him walk away. His shoulders stooped under some invisible weight. The mess hall felt suddenly too big, too empty. Outside the windows, night had fallen completely, and I could see the dark mass of the forest against the sky, stretching away into blackness. 6 loggers gone without a trace, 6 men who heard what I heard today. The only difference was that I had known the rule. Ignore any sounds of crying children. I pulled the laminated card from my pocket and read through the rules again. 6 rules. 6 missing men. I wondered which rule had cost Levi Sutherland his life. Which one had Craig Gutierrez broken while searching for his friend? I tucked the card back into my pocket, feeling its edges press against my leg. Tomorrow we'd go back into those woods, and the rules would be all that stood between us and whatever waited there. I stared at the laminated card in my hands, reading through the 6 rules for what felt like the 100th time. The connection was obvious now. Each rule represented someone who hadn't made it back. 6 rules, 6 missing men. I ran my thumb over the plastic coating, wondering about the stories behind each line. Those rules weren't made up out of thin air, Atticus said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. We sat alone in the mess hall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead while darkness pressed against the windows. Each one came from someone who saw something and lived to warn others. I looked up at him. "You said you've been here 15 years. Atticus nodded, his weathered face looking even older in the harsh lighting. "My first week on site, I heard it too. That crying." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" "I was marking trees with my partner. He went back to get more paint." Atticus's eyes fixed on something far away. Then I heard this kid crying. Sounded about 8, maybe 9 years old. Kept saying he was lost, begging for help. "And you didn't go to it?" "Almost did." He took a sip of coffee that must have gone cold. 2 steps toward that sound, and my partner came back. Grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, shook his head. Wouldn't say a word until we got back to the trucks. "What did he tell you?" "That his brother went missing in these woods 3 years before. Followed a crying child and never came back." Atticus set his mug down with a dull thud. "After that, I started collecting stories. Every time someone disappeared, I added another rule." I slipped the card back into my pocket. "And you followed them ever since?" "Every day." He pushed himself up from the table. "And I'm still here." The next morning, I met Eugene at the trucks as usual. The rules felt heavier in my pocket, weighted with the stories behind them. We headed into our section with chainsaws in hand, the forest quiet around us. Eugene seemed more on edge than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. We'd been cutting for about 2 hours when Eugene suddenly went rigid beside me. I followed his gaze to a branch about 15 feet away. A crow sat there, watching us, but not just any crow. This one was pure white, its feathers looking almost luminescent against the dark green backdrop. Not albino with red eyes, but completely white with black eyes that seemed to look straight through me. Eugene's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. I remembered Rule 5. If you see a white crow, do not move until it leaves. We stood frozen, my muscles cramping from holding the same position. The white crow tilted its head, studying us with an intelligence that felt impossible. Minutes stretched by, my watch ticking in what seemed like slow motion. 5 minutes passed, then 8. My back ached, and sweat trickled down my spine despite the cool air. "Don't move," Eugene whispered, so quietly I barely heard him. Not even a little. The crow hopped along the branch, getting closer. It made no sound, no cawing, no rustling of feathers. Just silent, deliberate movement. After what my watch said was 10 minutes, but felt like an hour, the white crow finally spread its wings and took off, flying deeper into the forest until it disappeared among the trees. Eugene let out a long, shaky breath. That was close. "What would have happened if we moved?" I asked, rolling my shoulders to ease the stiffness. Eugene just shook his head. "Don't ever find out." 3 days later, I experienced the forest's strange geography again. Eugene and I had split up to mark trees in adjacent sections, keeping within shouting distance of each other. I walked what should have been 50 yards to tag a tall Douglas fir, but when I turned around, I couldn't see or hear Eugene anymore. I called his name, getting only distant bird calls in response. Looking at my surroundings, nothing looked familiar. The trees I'd just walked past were gone, replaced by different configurations that made no sense. Remembering what happened last time, I fought down the panic rising in my chest. I pulled out my compass, noting I'd been heading east. According to the rules, I needed to get back to Eugene or the trucks within 15 minutes. I started walking west, counting my steps. After about 100 yards, the forest around me seemed to stretch and contract like I was looking through a warped lens. Trees that looked close took forever to reach. Others that seemed far away appeared in front of me after just a few steps. I checked my watch. 10 minutes had passed. I kept moving west, focusing on the compass needle, rather than the disorienting landscape. Just when I thought I'd have to radio Atticus, I pushed through a stand of cedars and nearly ran into Eugene, who was marking a tree not 20 feet from where I'd started. "Where'd you go?" he asked, looking confused. "I walked straight east about 50 yards, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But when I turned around, everything was different. Eugene nodded like this made perfect sense. Time and space get weird here sometimes. That's why we stay close to the trucks. A week later, it happened again. I was walking back from retrieving a tool from the truck, a simple 15-minute round trip that should have been straightforward. I kept the clearing in sight the whole time, but on the return journey, the path stretched impossibly. Each step took me nowhere, the trucks remaining the same distance away no matter how fast I walked. I stopped, remembering Atticus's advice. If distances seem wrong, stop walking. Close your eyes, count to 30, then open them and walk straight ahead no matter what you see. I did exactly that. When I opened my eyes, the forest looked completely different, darker with trees I didn't recognize. But I walked straight ahead anyway, keeping my breathing steady. After about 20 steps, the forest suddenly snapped back to normal, and I found myself at the edge of the clearing where Eugene waited with a concerned expression. "You're late," he said, checking his watch. I looked at mine. What should have been 15 minutes had turned into 45. "Got caught in another strange spot," I explained. Eugene nodded grimly. "It's getting worse. Forest doesn't want us here." As the days passed, I felt that truth more keenly. The forest seemed to press closer each morning, the trees leaning in, watching. The silence grew deeper. Even the birds sounded different, their calls taking on a mocking quality that made the hair on my neck stand up. I started keeping track of the days left in my assignment, marking them off on a small calendar I kept with my gear. 26 days left, then 20, then 15. "You're counting down," Atticus observed one evening as we loaded equipment. "Just keeping track," I said. He nodded. "Smart. This place knows when you're leaving. It gets jealous." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but Atticus's expression remained serious. "I'm not kidding, Miles. The closer you get to leaving, the more careful you need to be. I've seen it happen before. The forest tries harder when it knows it's running out of time." I looked back at the trees, their shadows stretching toward us as the sun set. For a second, I could have sworn they moved against the wind, reaching out like fingers. 13 more days, I said quietly. 13 days. Atticus repeated. "Follow the rules. Every single one of them." I nodded, feeling the weight of the laminated card in my pocket. The rules had kept me alive so far. 13 more days of vigilance, of white crows and crying children and paths that changed when you weren't looking. 13 more days in a forest that didn't want me there, that seemed to grow more resentful with each tree we cut. I could make it. I had to make it. But as we drove away that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from between the trees. Something patient and ancient that had all the time in the world to wait. I felt my boots sink into the soft earth as a light rain misted through the canopy above. It was my last day at the site, and I couldn't wait to get back to the mainland. Just 12 more hours of following the rules, watching my back, and I'd be free of this place. Eugene worked about 20 feet away, his saw cutting through a marked cedar with practiced efficiency. I'd grown used to his constant vigilance over the past weeks, the way his eyes never settled in one spot for long, how he positioned himself to maintain line of sight with me at all times. I wiped rain from my face and bent to check my saw's fuel level when I caught a flash of movement from the corner of my eye. Looking up, I saw them. Dozens of crows bursting from the trees deeper in the forest, their black wings beating frantically as they flew directly toward us. "Eugene!" I called, pointing at the approaching flock. Eugene's head snapped up. The moment he spotted the birds, he killed his saw engine and motioned urgently with his hand. "Trucks, now!" Rule 4 burned in my memory. If crows fly toward you, walk in the direction they came from. No questions, no hesitation. We abandoned our equipment where it lay and started walking rapidly toward the staging area, away from our work site and in the direction the crows had originated from. "They're coming fast," I said, glancing over my shoulder as we picked up our pace. "Don't look back," Eugene muttered. "Just keep moving." The crows cawed overhead with unusual intensity, not the casual calls I'd grown accustomed to hearing in the forest, but something more urgent, almost frantic. Their cries echoed through the trees, overlapping and building until it felt like a warning siren. "They're louder than normal," I said as we pushed through a stand of young firs. Eugene nodded without breaking stride. "Something's got them spooked. Something bad." We walked for what felt like 10 minutes, though my watch showed only 5 had passed. The forest seemed to stretch and contract around us, a sensation I'd grown familiar with but never comfortable. Trees that should have been 50 yards away appeared suddenly before us, while others receded despite our steady progress toward them. The staging area finally came into view through the trees, the orange safety cones and parked trucks a welcome sight. As we stepped into the clearing, the flock of crows passed directly overhead, their black wings blotting out patches of gray sky. Their caws grew even more intense as they flew over us, as if warning us away from something terrible hidden among the trees we'd just left. Eugene looked up at them, his face tight with concern. "Never heard them this worked up before." "What do you think it means?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nothing good. Forest knows it's your last day." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "You really think it knows?" "Places like this." Eugene trailed off, watching the crows disappear over the treetops. "They have their own way of knowing things." We reached the trucks, and I felt the forest closing in around me, pressing against the edges of the clearing like a physical presence. The trees seemed to lean inward, branches reaching toward us as if angered by our escape, by my escape. My imminent departure felt like a personal affront to whatever lived among those ancient trunks. I grabbed my gear bag from the truck bed and began methodically packing my equipment for the last time. My hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, cleaning, checking, storing, while my mind raced with thoughts of leaving this place behind. As I secured my chainsaw case, movement caught my eye at the forest edge. I looked up and spotted strange shadows moving between distant trees where no workers had been assigned. Not the familiar silhouettes of loggers or the natural sway of branches in the wind, but something else, something that seemed to flow rather than walk, slipping between trunks in a way that made my eyes struggle to focus. I blinked, and the shadows were gone. Had I imagined it? After weeks in this place, with its spatial distortions and time slips, I couldn't trust my own perception anymore. "You see that?" I asked, turning to Eugene, but he had walked to the other side of the truck to store his own gear. A hand landed on my shoulder, and I jumped, nearly dropping my tool belt. "Steady there," Atticus said, his weathered face creased with understanding. He'd appeared beside me without a sound, his blue eyes fixed on the tree line where I'd seen the movement. "I saw something," I told him, my voice lower than intended. Atticus nodded slowly, forest saying goodbye in its own way. He squeezed my shoulder, his calloused hand firm but reassuring. "You're one of the lucky ones, Miles. Not everyone gets to leave." The weight of his words settled over me like a physical thing. I thought about Levi Sutherland and Craig Gutierrez, about the other 4 men whose disappearances had created the rules that kept the rest of us alive. I thought about how close I'd come to joining them, when I'd gotten lost, when I'd heard the crying child. "I followed the rules," I said, almost to myself. "That you did." Atticus dropped his hand from my shoulder. "And now you get to go home." The other loggers were finishing their packing, their movements quick and efficient, eager to leave the site for the day. I secured the last of my gear in the truck and closed the tailgate with a solid thump. My countdown calendar, folded in my pocket, had its final day crossed off. I was done. Before climbing into the truck, I looked back at the tree line one final time. The forest stood dark and impenetrable, ancient trees rising like sentinels against the gray sky. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something white move among the dark trunks. Perhaps a flash of pale bark. Perhaps something else entirely. A cold certainty washed over me as I stared into those woods. Whatever lived there was watching me leave. I could feel its attention like a physical touch, patient, ancient, and utterly inhuman. It had tested me, tempted me, tried to claim me as it had claimed others. And though I was leaving, its presence would linger with me long after I departed this island. I climbed into the truck cab and pulled the door shut with more force than necessary. Eugene slid behind the wheel, his face relaxing slightly as he started the engine. "Ready to get out of here?" he asked, the first hint of a smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "More than ready," I answered, but I couldn't help glancing back at the forest one last time as we pulled away from the clearing. The trees remained motionless, revealing nothing of their secrets. But I knew with absolute certainty that they would be waiting, patient and hungry, for the next person who broke the rules. I stepped off the ferry onto the mainland, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and took a deep breath of air that didn't feel like it was watching me. The wind off the water carried the smell of salt and diesel, normal smells that didn't make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It had been 3 weeks since I'd left Vancouver Island, and I still caught myself looking over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. My new assignment was about an hour's drive inland, a standard clear-cutting operation with none of the whispered warnings or laminated rule cards, just trees that stayed where they were supposed to and paths that led where they should. The company truck waited in the parking lot, a different driver this time. No Atticus with his weathered face and knowing eyes. Just a guy named Dave who nodded when I approached, barely looking up from his phone. "You Moss?" he asked, thumbing something on his screen. "Yeah," I said, tossing my bag into the truck bed. "Cool. Hop in." The drive was quiet, just road noise and occasional radio static. Dave wasn't much for conversation, which suited me fine. I watched the landscape roll by. Normal trees that didn't seem to shift when you weren't looking at them. I reached into my back pocket, fingers finding the edge of the laminated card I'd transferred to my new wallet. I kept it there like some kind of talisman, though I couldn't say exactly why. The 6 rules were burned into my memory anyway. Always work in pairs. Never be alone in the forest. Stay within 15 minutes of the trucks. If crows fly toward you, walk in the direction they came from. If you see a white crow, do not move until it leaves. Ignore any sounds of crying children. I ran my thumb over the card's smooth surface. Insurance, maybe. A reminder that I wasn't crazy, that what happened on that island was real. The mainland operation ran like clockwork. No one froze when birds flew overhead. No one checked their watches obsessively to make sure they weren't losing time. We cut trees, loaded trucks, went home when the day was done. Normal. My partner was a guy named Ricky, mid-50s with a gray-streaked beard and calloused hands. He didn't hover within arm's reach like Eugene had. Sometimes he'd wander 50 yards away to mark trees or take a leak, completely unconcerned. The first time he did it, I nearly called after him. "Where you going?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at me like I'd asked why the sky was blue. "Marking that stand over there, back in 10. I nodded and turned back to my saw, but my eyes kept tracking to where he'd disappeared between the trees. My palms went sweaty. 5 minutes passed. 7. 9. When he reappeared exactly where he'd said he would, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You okay?" he asked, noticing my white-knuckle grip on the chainsaw. "Yeah," I said, just thinking about something else. After a few weeks, I stopped counting the minutes when he walked away. After a month, I stopped looking up every time birds flew overhead, but I still kept the card in my wallet. The dreams started about 2 months after I left the island. Always the same. I was back in those woods, surrounded by trees that seemed to breathe. The paths twisted, never leading where they should, and somewhere, always just out of sight, a child was crying. I'd wake up sweating, convinced for a few seconds that I was still there, that I needed to follow the rules or I'd never make it out. One night it was bad enough that I got up, turned on every light in my apartment, and sat at my kitchen table until morning, the laminated card laid out in front of me like some kind of ward against evil. The next day, I called in sick and drove to the nearest library. The reference section was empty except for an elderly woman reading a newspaper. I sat at one of the computers and typed, "Vancouver Island Missing Persons History." The search returned hundreds of results. I narrowed it down, adding forest and unexplained. What I found wasn't surprising, but seeing it laid out in black and white made my stomach turn. Reports going back decades, not just loggers, but hikers, campers, even a few locals who'd lived on the edge of certain forests. People who went in and never came out. Most of the articles were brief mentions, buried in local papers. A hiker who separated from his group for less than 10 minutes. A woman who stepped away from her campsite to take photos of a deer. A teenager who wandered off during a family picnic. Some reports mentioned extensive searches, dogs that refused to track, helicopters that found nothing but unbroken canopy, ground teams that covered the same areas over and over, finding no trace. One article from the 1970s quoted a search and rescue worker. "It's like the forest just swallowed them whole." I printed a dozen articles and took them home, spreading them across my coffee table that night. I read each one carefully, looking for patterns. Most disappearances happened to people who were alone, even briefly. Several mentioned unusual silence before the person vanished. 2 reports from different decades described the missing person, mentioning hearing a child crying shortly before they disappeared. I folded the articles and tucked them into my bedside drawer, next to the laminated card. I didn't need them to tell me what I already knew. The rules existed for a reason, written one by one as people disappeared. Blood lessons, like Atticus had said. 6 months after leaving the island, my phone buzzed with a text while I was eating dinner. "Unknown number. It's Eugene. Got your number from Atticus. Wanted you to know I'm done with logging. Found something else. Thought you should know why." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Me. What happened? The reply came almost immediately. "Eugene. New guy. Broke Rule 3. We told him 15 mine from trucks max. He went too far. Said he knew a shortcut back." Me. "Did they find anything?" Eugene. "Same as the others. Nothing. No tracks, no gear. Nothing." I put my phone down and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. I thought about the new guy, whoever he was, walking a path that seemed right until suddenly it wasn't. I wondered if he heard the crying, if he tried to follow it, if he was still there, somewhere in that impossible forest, walking paths that never led home. Eugene, you got out, smart move. Me, you should too. Eugene, already did. Got a job at my cousin's garage, never going back in those woods. Me, good. Eugene, still have that card? I thought about the laminated rules in my wallet, carried like a talisman. Me, yeah. You? Eugene, every day. Some things you don't forget. I put the phone down and sat back at the table, my food gone cold. I understood what Eugene meant. Some things you don't forget because you can't. They become part of you, changing how you see the world. I'd spent months trying to make sense of what happened on that island. Researching, gathering evidence, looking for explanations. But in the end, it didn't matter if I understood. What mattered was that I'd followed the rules, and I'd survived. Some places don't care if you understand them. They only care if you respect them. The forest on Vancouver Island was ancient, patient, operating by rules humans hadn't written and couldn't fully comprehend. It didn't need me to understand why crows flying toward me meant danger, or why a white crow required absolute stillness. It only needed me to obey. That night, I took the laminated card from my wallet and pinned it to my bulletin board where I could see it every morning. Not because I needed the reminder anymore, those 6 rules were carved into my memory forever, but because it was proof. Proof that I'd faced something beyond explanation and walked away. And proof that something ancient and patient still waited in those woods for those who broke the rules. Sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, I still heard the echo of a child crying in the wilderness. On those nights, I'd keep my eyes closed and remind myself of Rule 6. Ignore any sounds of crying children. Even now, hundreds of miles away, it felt important to remember.